Perfect.
Welcome. Firstly, thank you to all Gedalia Society members for coming. Thanks to all members of Hatzalah that came. A tremendous thank you to our organizer and all-around force of nature, Irit, for making this night happen and allowing us to help. Thanks, Rabbi Reichman, Dr. Rabbi Reichman, and his permutations and advice for coming and making this event possible. Rabbi Dr. Reichman is a professor of emergency medicine and medical ethics in Einstein College of Medicine. He received the Smitha from the Reed Smith program at Yeshiva University and writes and lectures internationally to audiences the world over on topics relating to foreign medicine. Rabbi Reichman lectures so extensively that some have said that a Jewish organization cannot actually be a Jewish organization until Rabbi Reichman gives them a private speech. He was recently appointed as the Reb Moshe and Bella Tendler Chair in Jewish Medical Ethics at Yeshiva College, and has recently published the book, The Anatomy of Jewish Law, a fresh dissection of the relation between medicine, medical history, and rabbinic literature. I think we can all agree that's a title equally as long as it is punny. Rabbi Reichman's writings are extensive, and there's more articles than I think I can count. Without any further ado, Rabbi Reichman.
Should we just put it on
I think they'll hear you through
what do
the
you call it mode on
screen mode.
slideshow, right?
Yep.
Well, so he's trying to set up. Good evening, everybody. Great to see you all. Really amazing to be at the Gedalia Society. I have such tremendous reverence for the Gedalia Society. I don't know what number time this is that I have the supposed to join you. I also thank you, Reeds, and the rest of the amazing crew for all the extraordinary things that you do. As with many people, the last time that I was here was pre-COVID. And a lot has happened in all of our lives since the last time we got together in this kind of venue. So it is a sheer pleasure to see you in person, and not in Zoom anymore. I can just stand by the laptop. There you go.
You have to point it to him.
This is his first slide. Yeah.
Okay.
We're just not gonna have any room service, right? Because we don't have lockable suitcases.
I'll just get a little closer.
I
Nothing.
think the receiver was just behind the computer now that.
Nothing. Just have something on the Zoom.
What?
Oh, do I need to move for the Zoom? Maybe I'll.
No. That's him.
So what I'd like to do with you guys today is a number of things. First of all, I want to share with you some interesting developments. One particular interesting development, which I hope you'll find interesting. This picture. Well, let me share it with you actually, just by coincidence or hashgacha. I was listening to a podcast on this presentation. How many of us are podcasters? So I think or listen to podcasts. I think usually it's commuters. If you're a commuter, you're going to be listening to podcasts. If you're not commuting, you're probably not listening to podcasts. That's usually the fork in the road. So I happen to be a commuter. I travel, roughly an hour to work to get from Long Island to the Bronx to Montefiore, where I work in the emergency department of Montefiore. What I was listening to just now in the car before I got here was a podcast called Gate Crashers, and what it was about the Ivy League schools in this country and their restriction of admissions to Jews in the early 1900s. And what is interesting about this, and this is obviously our discussion, but it turns out that many of the aspects of applications for universities and elite universities were developed exclusively and specifically in order to keep Jews out of the university. So the very admission process that we are all used to today, which includes extensive admission applications, which asks about your parents and where your parents are from and what profession your parents have, all started so that it would be a tip-off for them. There was actually Jews that were applying to the university and they could keep the Jews out. The interview, which was never part of the Columbia. I was listening about specifically Columbia University. Columbia, Yale, Harvard, Princeton never had interviews. They introduced the interview specifically so they could see that it was a Jew that was applying, because sometimes the name wasn't so clear because people changed their names. And in order to keep out Jews. Unfortunately, after World War II, things changed, and Baruch Hashem, Jews are able to attend any university pretty much in this country. But what I want to share with you is a little bit of history for medical students specifically. This is a healthcare related event. It's something that I've personally been involved in. For Jews, like people here who were interested in healthcare, interested in becoming physicians hundreds of years ago, not like just over the last century, but many hundreds of years ago. So if you lived in the Middle Ages, you lived in the 1400s, 1500s, 1600s, and you were a frum Jew and you wanted to become a physician, you did not have the option to go to university. That wasn't an option. There were many universities that existed in Europe. Why couldn't you go to university? The reason you couldn't go is because universities were run by Christians. They were run under the auspices of the Catholic Church. And the Pope had explicitly said that Jews are not allowed to attend university. To graduate any university and become a physician, you have to avow your belief in Christianity. So pretty much any from Jew from attending university. It doesn't mean there weren't Jewish physicians. There were Jewish physicians and midwives and bloodletters and felchers, they were called throughout all the centuries, but they usually trained by apprenticeship. But things changed with one university, roughly around 1500 or so. And that university was the University of Padua. Now, the University of Padua is in northern Italy. Somewhere around the 1500s, despite the fact that they were in Italy, they were not run under the auspices of the church, and they decided for the first time ever to allow non-Catholics to attend, which included Protestants and included Jews. So Jews were now able to attend a university. And it was a very, very exciting thing for the Jews at that time. And it was not a minor university. This is the university where people like William Harvey, Galileo, Copernicus, these are the people that were associated in teaching at this university. This is just for a few moments I'm going to share with you. This year is the 800th anniversary of this university. I spent a lot of time researching that. That's not our discussion, but it just so happens that literally right now, literally right now, there's an exhibit which I actually helped coordinate this city of Padua, Italy, on the history of Jews training at the University of Padua. And this is the exhibit over here, and this is the flyer for the exhibit. Reichman, Medicine, University of Padua.
Another what? Yeah.
Got it? And actually, it was posted on the December 30th. It's actually continuing until next week. For those of you who are going to Padua in a couple of days, you can still catch it.
Come on, bro. You come on to play. Just say it.
But I got it.
You don't have to hit place.
So it's basic.
It's gonna go.
So I'll just show you the fascinating archival material. Share with you some of the fascinating archival material from the university. And there's two very
Much lecture.
English medical students. I'm going to show you, I mentioned William Harvey. We're all familiar with William Harvey, who discovered circulation of blood. Awesome.
Yeah, I think anything will
I
work
think
at
we're
this
good.
point.
Okay, strong replies. Okay, so this is the diploma of William Harvey.
No.
Is it the diploma?
Let me listen to this on the couch. No.
A Jew studied in Plymouth University.
No, it's not 2 pounds of chicken.
Jew,
It's 2 pounds of chicken?
and your mother's paying for your tuition, she is not going to want to see that on your diploma when you come home. So what they did is they actually changed the diploma specifically for the Jews. And it says in Dei Eternae, meaning in the name of the eternal God. So they specifically accommodated the Jews in that period of time. And this is the 1600s. This diploma is from the 1600s. This one diploma is very, very unique. And I'll just share with you, see if you can actually read it. Over here, I pulled out this. This is the diploma. And I pulled out this little area here. And this is what it says. Can anyone read that?
Oh, my glasses. Seichel tov l'chol hazeh, Tila Simez Lai.
Reishis Chochma Yiras Hashem Seichel Tov L'Chol Haseim.
Yeah.
Now, what's absolutely extraordinary is there's no doubt in my mind whatsoever, zero, that was on the diploma when he received it from the university. It clearly was not written by the artists and by the scribes of the university. This is from 1647. A frum student took his diploma and added to his medical diploma from the university, Reishis Chochma Yiras Hashem Seichel Tov L'Chol Haseim, to show that the relationship between his Yiddishkeit and his practice of medicine. I've never, ever seen anything like this before. This was another diploma from the University of Padua, in Dei Eternae Nomine, in the name of the eternal God. This is the student, his name is Milky. And this, on the bottom, this was on the bottom of his picture. Now, what is this a picture of? So some say that Art Scroll added this black hat. But this has nothing to do with Art Scroll. What this is a picture of, this is what the graduation involved at the University of Padua in the 1600s. They had a wreath that they put on the head of the graduate, a ring that they put on his finger, a special black hat, or a beretta it was called in Italian, and they opened and closed books as part of the graduation ceremony to demonstrate the transmission of knowledge. This was the pomp and circumstance of every major European university. And it also shows that the Jews actually were involved in these kinds of ceremonies. And this one, you should be able to figure out which Shevet this guy was from. His name is Samuel Cohen. And this was his family. His family tree over here was the crown and the raven and the hands from the Kohen. Now this is somebody who didn't get the in Dei Eternae Nomine, and his mother was very upset, of course, because it says in Christe Nomine. And this one I found, I don't know if you'll agree with me, that this one is crossed out. This is from Luzzatto, Raphael Luzzatto. This is crossed out in Dei Nomine, and I think actually what it used to say is it used to say in Yushka Nomine, and they erased it and they adapted it. It was like a templated diploma, and they adapted it for that particular student. And just they also had poems which they wrote in honor of graduates of the University of Padua. I'm not going to discuss this now. I just want to share with you that I've discovered over the last few years over 100 poems written for these students that spanned about 150 years of Jewish students going to this university in Italy, one of the only universities that would allow Jews to attend. And I'll share with you as the last bit, this is someone who registered, and this is his name in the registry, but we don't have a record of his graduation nor a diploma. And if you can figure out who this is, I will give you 2 extra bowls of cholent. Who said that? That is correct. That is correct. This is the registry from 1723. Moise, Moshe. Vita. Vita is Chaim. Luzzatto. Di Giacoba, son of Yaakov. Ibreo, the Jew. And we have a record. This isn't his signature. This is just the university inserting his name into the registry. This is 1723, 1725, and 1726. We have from 3 semesters he registered. This was the medical school registry. In 1723, he was 16 years old. And we also have, we mentioned these poems. We have one of the poems that he wrote for a fellow classmate, Emmanuel Calvo, in 1724. You can see on the bottom, it says Moshe Chaim ben Yaakov Lutzato, and he wrote a poem on behalf of one of those students. And for those of you who want to get a little piece of this history, just about a few weeks ago in December of 2022, there was a major auction by Ginazim. I don't know if you're familiar with this auction house.
My cousin's the auctioneer.
Oh yeah. Very good. It's great. I sit at work, actually. I keep the window open. I'm watching the sales. It's amazing how much money some of this stuff is going for. They had a couple items over $1 million, over $1 million for a couple of the items at this auction. So this is a graduate. Tuvia Harofe is one of the graduates of Padua. You could have bought his sefer called Masa Tuvia, which was published in 1707. They estimated it would go between 6 and 8. It ended up going for $17,360. And this is a very famous image from that. This house illustration, it's called, on the right, where you compared the workings of the house to the working of a human being. But he ended his book, and with this we'll transition into our current 20th century, 21st century topic. He wrote at the end of his introduction to his sefer, he said, "Below Ya'aleh," and he was a graduate of the University of Padua. He came from Poland. He was a ben yeshiva in Poland, a very learned man. His father was a very learned man, Mechaber Svarim. He said, "Below Ya'aleh alev shum adam b'chol eretz Italia, Polania, Ashkenaz, v'Tzarfat," because all of those, and these were people came from to train in Padua. For all those of you who are coming from Italy, from Poland, from Germany, from France, and you want to study medicine, unless you have filled your belly, so to speak, with learning Torah Shebechsav and Torah Shebal Peh. Meaning, make sure you've studied extensively before you enter medical school, because medical school is a big obligation. You have a tremendous amount to study, not going to have as much time for learning. So make sure you do a lot of learning before you actually enter into medical school. So that was just a little brief introduction, just to share with you what's going on now. And again, it's running for another week. If anyone does go to Italy, I'll give you my phone number. You can call me, and I'll give you a little tour of the exhibit. So the topic we're going to talk about is ancestry DNA. Now, before we begin this topic, I just want to ask how many people here have undergone ancestry DNA testing? Anybody? So none of us here, which is to me is interesting. So I speak about ancestry DNA. It's one of the topics I speak about. So I ask this question at the beginning of every talk. I could say of all the, quote, modern Orthodox from Jews, very small percentage of people are testing, say like 10 to 15% of the Jewish community is testing. I gave this talk once in London to say 50 to 75 people, roughly ages from late 20s to early 40s. And I said, how many of you have done ancestry DNA testing? I kid you not, every single hand in the crowd went up. Every single hand went up. To this day, I haven't done any studies on this. I don't know why that is. I'm not sure. I mean, they weren't all from England. They were from continental Europe also. Many of them weren't always from, and it could be they're seeking for identity. But to this day, I still don't know why there's such a discrepancy between sort of the American Jewish population and the European Jewish population in terms of their desire to do ancestry DNA. What I'm going to do is I'm going to read for you a summary of a book. This is not a fictional book. This is a true book. I don't know how many of you have heard of it. It's called Inheritance by a woman named Dani Shapiro, who herself is not religious today. She comes from a religious family. I'm going to read the summary of this book, and I'm going to ask you to pay close attention, because I'm going to ask you to identify issues that we need to discuss from this story about some of the details, which I think you'll find fascinating. And here's what she writes. She says, one evening, my husband mentioned that he was sending away for a commercial DNA testing kit. He asked if I wanted to order me one as well. I could easily have said no. I wasn't curious about my ancestry. I knew where I came from. Eastern European Ashkenazi Jews on both parents' sides. Instead, I said yes. By the way, how many people have been barraged in their emails with discounts for ancestry DNA testing over the last couple of weeks? right? Around holiday season, around Kratzmach season, around New Year's, every day you're getting 50% discount for Ancestry DNA, which is impressive because Jews usually take discounts. So the fact that none of you have taken a discount to me is also very interesting. The results, when I received them a few months later, changed everything I had ever understood about myself. I was only half Eastern European Ashkenazi, as it turned out. A person I had never heard of was identified as a first cousin. Now, let me clarify that, because you may not be familiar. When you enter your DNA into the database, they will not only tell you, based on population studies, where they think you come from, they will tell you if you have relatives in that database. So in that very database, she had a first cousin that she didn't know existed. So she knew something was clearly amiss over here. How is it possible for not to know a first cousin? The truth was unavoidable. My beloved father, who tragically died in a car accident when I was 23, had not been my biological father. This discovery led me deep into a world I had known nothing about. I have spent the past few years piecing together the story of how I came to be and the truth of where and who I come from. In 1961, my parents, Orthodox Jews who married later in life, were having trouble conceiving. My mother, nearing 40, was desperate to have a child. They went to a reproductive institute where they were told that a, quote, treatment called a booster. Now, booster means something a little different today. Don't get confused with our definition of booster. Was available to help solve my father's infertility. The practice of the day was to mix donor sperm with the intended father's sperm in order to keep alive the possibility that the child was biologically his. Now, this next sentence is the most remarkable. It took just 36 hours from the time I learned that my father was not my biological father until I found the man who was. And this was all at home, just on her laptop, with no other assistance. He was 78, a retired physician and medical ethicist, and I can imagine how stunned he must have been to receive my email with the subject line, important letter. I share many physical traits with my biological father: his blue eyes, fair hair, pale skin, tendency to blush, his small hands and high forehead. This would be expected. But we also share the same favorite novel, Wallace Stegner's Crossing to Safety. When I met him, I understood for the first time where aspects of my very personhood had come from. True story. One of many, many such stories that we have already been revealed, and many more that are soon to be discovered in the very near future. So what issues do we need to discuss from a halachic perspective about this particular case?
There's a crazy study recently that was being published that, like, after, I guess, the dude was taken to Rome after the we're like 40-70% Italian. You see that?
So this one I didn't.
Something new that just came up. I'll pull it up. I had it over there. It's something really, really good. Saying that Ashkenazi Jews since then are very homogeneous, but prior to either.
Oh, so what you are referring to, which we will discuss a little later on, is they did genetic analysis on a number of bones in a cemetery in Germany. And the number 47 is the number of remains, number of bodies that they actually extracted DNA from. And they found out that we are more homogeneous than they were then in about 1400s in Erfurt in Germany.
40 to 70% Italian mixed with Ashkenazi Jewish, and I'm like, that's shocking number. Like more than half Italian.
Well,
That's very surprising.
wouldn't that aspect be a mix of genetics as well as history?
So
Well, that's part of the challenge is interfacing what we see in genetics with what's going on historically at that time. Yeah, that's the big challenge. There's no question that each one of our gene pools is going to be very different in terms of which country we come from, which heritage we come from. And obviously it could differ extensively depending on the genetic pool. Even though the Ashkenazi population has a significant percentage of homogeneity. But obviously there, even on top of that, there's still some significant variation.
Genes, there's like 4.
So there, that theory which developed, which has now been questioned by this new information from the cemetery in Germany, and I don't profess to be an expert in population genetics, but they postulated there were 4 founder mothers that begat the entire Ashkenazi population, and they assumed they traced it back to around the 1600s, sometimes post the Khmelnytsky rebellion, where many of the Jews. So this, I'm sorry. So these remains are before, right? So the question is, how do you interface those two? And they think maybe the bottleneck, because they're finding some similarities, the bottleneck may have actually occurred, before the 1600s, not necessarily at 1600s. Whatever. So be that as it may. Yeah. So the point is, right, that it decimated the population. So there were very few people left. So it's from that nucleus of people, which is very few in number, which generated the subsequent Ashkenazi population. That was the theory. Now, the problem with these population genetics is a lot of these are just theories. In terms of relationships, who you're finding in the database that's related to you, that's not theory, that's fact.
But then I was talking about podcasts, they're talking about population based on some of these testing, these commercially available testing. They're not, as I tell you, you're from Western Africa. It's only a certain, they're 35% sure that you're from Western Africa.
So those statistics are evolving, and they're getting much more accurate. There used to be discrepancy between all the different companies. Now the companies are more falling in line with each other, and the tests are becoming higher percentages and more sophisticated. And that's going to change. That's going to evolve over time. But what other issues do we need to discuss? Yeah. Sure.
Yeah, I was gonna say what were the things that we talked about?
Well, first of all, core of mamzer,
So mamzeris is a big one, right? So is she a mamzeris?
Jewish, so that considered custodian Nazir?
So that's part of our discussion. Does the fact that the donor was not Jewish, does that impact on her status? Is she a mamzeris?
Not. A lady gets pregnant, right? That's the theoretical. Like the Sula that gets pregnant by going to the bathhouse.
So going pregnant in the bathhouse, by the way, is an interesting discussion. The Gemara in Chagiga talks about pregnancy in a bathhouse, which is in the world of medicine and halacha, it's very hard to find precedent for new developments. So if you're dealing with kashrus, there's also a lot of new and exciting stuff in kashrus too. But if you're dealing with medicine, where now you have respirators and kidney transplants and artificial insemination and surrogate motherhood, where are you going to find precedent for some of these things? In a literature which is thousands of years old. So the bathhouse insemination is a fascinating precedent for artificial insemination. What is artificial insemination? Artificial insemination is taking the zera, taking the reproductive seed of a man, inseminating a woman in the absence of any physical contact. Artificial insemination. So the Gemara in Chagiga has the following question. A Kohen Gadol is only allowed to marry a woman who's never had relations before. He needs to marry a virginal woman. Regular Kohen doesn't have that requirement, but a Kohen Gadol has that requirement. So Gemara says, what if a woman claims to be a virginal woman, but she's pregnant? Is he allowed to marry her? Gemara says. So the Gemara says she's not really, she's saying she hasn't had relations with a man, but she obviously had relations with a man. So obviously, it's not an issue. The Gemara says, no, maybe she became pregnant in a bathhouse. And you're going to ask me, is it physiologically possible today, in the 21st century, for a woman to conceive in a bathhouse? The answer is, I can't tell you that it can't happen.
Stranger things have happened.
Stranger things have happened. Stranger things have happened. It's potentially physiologically possible. And actually, there is another source. It's not a medrash. It's not really a Jewish source or a halachic source, shall we say? It says that there was a man by the name of Ben Sira. Anyone ever hear the name Ben Sira? So Ben Sira was. So you'll see when he lived. So according to this account, Ben Sira wrote literature similar to Shlomo HaMelech, similar to Mishlei. He wrote a sefer called Chochmas Ben Sira, which interestingly is part of the canon of the Catholic Church, but it's not part of our canon. But according to the source, Ben Sira was the son of Yirmiyahu Hanavi. And what happened according to the story? According to the story, Yirmiyahu Hanavi went into a bathhouse and he rebuked these men in the bathhouse. They didn't take too kindly to it, and they forced him to emit his reproductive seed into the bathhouse. Yirmiyahu's own daughter went to bathe in the waters of that bathhouse and became pregnant from her father's seed. And that child was Ben Sira.
No wonder the Catholic Church took it.
right. And what about the Catholic Church took it? Immaculate conception, right? That could be. So, and Ben Sira was not considered a bastard. He wasn't considered a mamzer. That's part of our discussion, because there was no, even though he was the product of a father and a daughter. Parenthetically, the sources say that his name used to be Ben Zera. You say, oh, right. So apparently he also said that when he got older. He said, "This is a terrible name. I can't go around this name." So they changed it to Ben Sira. The gematria, the numerical value of Sira, is Yirmiyahu. Exact same gematria. So he was the son. It's an illusion of the fact that he was the son of Yirmiyahu. So I'm getting just a little way off on the tangents here. But so yes, we will talk about mamzeros. We'll talk about artificial insemination. Yes.
There's some of recognize you can test. If you have to follow the test, then you're not talking about the listen.
So does halacha recognize DNA testing? Good, excellent, very, very important question, and very much a part of our discussion. When and if, and is it a one size fits all? Does halacha always accept DNA testing? Or does halacha never accept DNA testing? Or does it depend on the circumstance? And you'll see that it's going to be the latter. Any other thoughts, questions? So did they ask a shaila? So we'll find out if they.
Back to the rabbi. It goes back to the rabbi that allowed her parents to do this. And now they're not saying, he's basically saying like out of compassion for the couple, he was like, you don't know, like, yeah.
First of all, was she Jewish?
Well, yeah.
Oh, so you guys all know that. So she didn't know that. She didn't know that. She was afraid she wasn't Jewish. So who did she go to? Where did her father daven? Father davened at KJ. And she went to Rabbi Lickstein. And she asked Rabbi Lickstein if she's Jewish. They said, you don't have to worry. Judaism goes by the mother, doesn't go by the father. So you're halachically Jewish.
But if she was a boy and you find out that most of the fathers are claim, she's no longer that son would no longer be a common.
If she was a boy, that's correct. That's correct. We'll talk about that too. I mean, I'm not gonna. We'll go through some of these topics right now. So let's talk for a few moments about artificial insemination and how this relates to this to her particular circumstances. You have a question now. So who knows? Who wants to guess? You're not necessarily going to know. Who wants to guess when in the modern era when the first successful case of a woman becoming pregnant from artificial insemination was?
1976.
So the answer is artificial insemination. Yes.
I'm sure.
So the answer is in the 1700s. Answer is in the 1700s. A man by the name of John Hunter. John Hunter had a man who had an anatomical abnormality. He couldn't impregnate his wife. So he said, collect your seed. And he actually created a pipette and he said, inject it into your wife. And so he did, and she conceived a child. Parenthetically, John Hunter, who was, for those of you who ever go to England, and are interested in medical history museums, there's a fascinating museum called the Hunterian Museum. John Hunter collected all sorts of crazy, both human and animal specimens, congenital abnormalities, really fascinating stuff. I should have said that maybe after eating, before eating probably. So, and John Hunter, by the way, also had at least one from medical student in the 1700s who was training with him in England. that student wrote a book on the circulation of the blood. In the introduction, he has some psukim in Hebrew from the Torah talking about the blood. And he gives profound thanks and recognition to his professor, the amazing John Hunter, who was really the Gaon of that time, which is quite amazing. So, but it didn't come into practice till the late 1800s, early 1900s. Didn't become very popular in medicine until the 1930s, 1940s. So the poskim started to talk about it in the 60s, the 50s and 60s. And Rav Moshe was one of the first poskim who would talk about it. The Piskei Halacha that Rav Moshe wrote really set the trend and the climate upon which all of assisted reproduction is built literally until today. This is like 60 years ago. So the Piskei Halacha that he developed back then are largely accepted and really facilitated the development. And this is the example. I don't know if you want me to read in Hebrew or in English, but it says Bedin Zrikas Zera L'Me'eha Isha, regarding inserting seed into the woman. Shechichu Rofim, and he writes, I'll read in English, regarding the new procedure developed by physicians of injecting reproductive seed into a woman's body. As my son-in-law, Moshe Tendler, I have to change it, unfortunately, Zichrono Livracha, Rabbi Tendler passed away this past year, for those of you who are not familiar. Rabbi Tendler was one of the giants of the world of medical halacha. As my son-in-law, Rabbi Tendler, informs me, that which they add donor sperm to the husband's sperm, this is the exact case, which is called a booster, is a deception to appease the husband. So he should think that the child derives from his seed and that he is the father. In truth, his sperm accomplishes nothing, and while the Talmud considers the possibility of shared paternity, we'll leave that for another time, there is only one halachic father. In this case, it is the donor. So how do I know? So I originally read the book Inherit, and I thought maybe they asked Rav Moshe the Shaila. Maybe Rav Moshe was the posek they went to. Maybe she was a child of this original Shaila. But I know that's not true. How do I know that's not true? Because this was his psak. He said, in this case, since the husband's sperm does not contribute to conception and is only used for psychological purposes, it'd be usher for the husband to procure his seed. So he's not allowed to do it unless they heard the psak and they just didn't accept it. But he wouldn't have allowed him to do it. So right, it'd be zero level. So it'd be,
it's not a psychological choice. I mean, there is a psychological benefit.
Well, that psychological benefit wouldn't justify it. You could maybe justify it for other psychological benefits. And I'll give you an example of justifying for a psychological benefit. So with potential use. So in oncofertility, fertility preservation for people who have cancers, right? So let's say you have a single male, he's not married, and some would say if he's not married, it's machlokas, not married, then maybe you're not allowed to and he's going to get chemotherapy, which is going to impact his fertility. So you need to preserve the seed before the fertility treatments.
Before the chemo, I mean.
Before the chemo treatment. So are you allowed to procure seed? So you could make an intellectual argument that he's not married, and maybe since he's not married, it's not permitted, and some do say that. But if you give somebody the hope of the possibility of future fertility, that could have a significant impact on the success of his therapy. So that's a case possibly where psychological dimension might permit, but not in this case. But not in this case. In with respect to
this donor sperm, what about the wife's, sense of,
that the child was her husband's versus somebody else, again, wouldn't rise to the level of permitting it. Something to talk about, something to consider, but wouldn't rise to the level of permitting it. So the other major aspect that Rav Moshe paskined on, which is absolutely essential to this whole discussion and future treatments, is that it is clear in the absence of an illicit physical relationship, a woman is not defined as an adulteress, sota, and is not prohibited from her husband. Furthermore, the resulting child is kosher, is not considered a mamzer, as bastardy or mamzerus is only created through a physical relationship. So if you think just genetically, then genetically you'll have you have a woman who's conceiving a child from a man who's not her husband. That sounds like mamzeris to me. That sounds like adultery to me. But that's not the way Moshe framed it. If there's no physical relationship, it's only the illicit physical relationship which generates the status of bastardy, generates the status of mamzeris. And since there's no physical relationship in artificial insemination, there is no mamzeris. So that was an extremely important psak, which facilitated the whole field of artificial insemination using a donor. But then the next issue which he had to deal with, and I should have it here, but I guess I don't have it here. Oh yeah, here. So the next issue you have to deal with is the following. So now, and I suspect most of you know this because you're a learned audience, but if you had a choice to choose a donor and you had a choice between a Jewish donor and a non-Jewish donor, who are you going to choose? So you guys know that, but if you're thinking sort of before Rav Moshe, you're thinking, you're the first person making this psak, and you have a choice between introducing Jewish sperm into the lineage, or specifically saying we don't want the Jewish, reproductive seed, we want the non-Jewish reproductive seed. That sounds a little counterintuitive, right? You'd think like that's crazy. Of course you'd want, especially, and this is like, after the Holocaust, and this is like, you want to perpetuate the Jewish progeny. So, the Rav Moshe looked at it from a purely halachic perspective. And he said, you're much better off using a non-Jewish sperm. Now, why? Why are you better off using a non-Jewish seed? What do you gain by that?
Because it's that person who grew up and marry a brother or sister.
So the concern is of Shema Yisa Achas Achoso, or consanguinity is the English term, the medical term, that maybe this person will have a child, this person who's a donor, donated seed, produced a child, then he'll have his own natural children. And maybe, just maybe, the child that he produces from his donation is a boy. The child that he has from his own natural children is a girl. They're roughly around the same age. Every 20 years, 25 years later, they meet each other. Lo and behold, you have a paternal brother and sister, marrying. And what do we call that? We call that Arias. That's an Issur D'Oraisa. So because he was concerned about that, he said it's better not to use Jewish seed. Again, they weren't, and it's primarily because they didn't identify who that seed came from. You just knew it was Jewish, but you didn't know who the Jew was. Now, how does that not happen with a non-Jew? How does using non-Jewish sperm prevent that?
Because there's no lineage to go
So
to.
the answer is the following, and I'll this to make it clear. Let's take a simple case where it's not even a case of artificial insemination. Let's say it's just a case of a Jewish woman who has a physical relationship with a non-Jewish man and produces a child. Right? Is the child Jewish? 100%. Is a child a mamzer?
No.
So we paskin no. There is a shita that says the child would be a mamzer. We actually paskin no. If it's a non-Jewish father, it's no. Who is the halachic father of that child?
This lady's married? She married?
No, it
Doesn't matter.
He doesn't have a chiyuv of any.
Let's say she's not married. She's not married. She's single.
There's no chiyuv. The child has no chiyuv to any of.
So the answer is he has no halachic father. Even though he has a genetic father, if he asks the biologist, he asks the geneticist who's the father, he'll tell you, this father has the X chromosome that donated to this child.
Still like
No, he doesn't. There's no Yerusha.
There's no
halachic connection to the father whatsoever. Zero. There's no.
Correct.
Right. So there is a question if a guy who has children is Megayer with his children, whether there's a relationship between the father and son. And that's an interesting machlokas. But the assumption is that when a family is Megayer, everyone is kakat and shnola dami, all familial bonds are dissolved. But that remains machlokas. So if that's the case with the physical relationship, then of course that's the case with artificial insemination. If you use artificial insemination from a non-Jew, there's no father. And if there's no halachic father, it is impossible to marry a paternal sibling, because no paternal sibling exists. And what we'll see in a few moments is just how prophetic Moshe was in terms of his concern about this. Because you might think, yeah, what are the odds of that happening? Come on. Like, what are the odds of people growing up and marrying each other, right?
Marcus Lehman, just in time.
What's that? What is it?
Marcus Lehman, Marcus Lehman, the writer of books. Irrit, we have a gift for him. Oh, it's a famous story.
Famous story, I gotta know.
Yeah.
So that's the issue. But that's the issue with mamzerus with artificial insemination. So we said that there is no mamzerus, but let's talk about a different twist on mamzerus that's reflected in these DNA testing, and it's a slightly different scenario. Same kind of results, but coming from a different place. This is a professor at MIT. His name is Stuart Schreiber. On July 2017, Stuart Schreiber writes, "My world turned upside down when I discovered that the man who raised me was not my biological father. What followed was a challenging path of learning and insight into family truths that brought great joy and made me a better person. I am a biological truth seeker, looking to gain insights into human biology and our genomes in order to mitigate suffering and death from disease. By analyzing DNA variations in persons with and without disease, my research is providing blueprints for therapeutics that are safe and effective." He is a decorated scientist at MIT and Harvard, one of the leaders of the Broad Institute, which is a major institute of microbiology and genetics at Harvard. He did this test. He found out his father is not his biological father. But this wasn't a case where they went to Rav Moshe and they got a Shaila. This is a different kind of case. His mother had an affair, and he was the product of that affair. And he discovered that through this ancestry DNA testing. And he actually says that he was physically abused by his father. The other children were not. His father's not alive when he got the test, so he couldn't sort of discuss it with him. His mother wasn't alive either. So he assumes that his father knew that it wasn't really his child. And that was what was going on. So the question from our perspective is, if this was everybody here involved was Jewish, is a DNA test sufficient to determine bastardy? Now, I don't know how many of you will admit to watching afternoon television, but if you turn on the TV anytime after 2:00, you will probably hear this phrase: "You are not the father." You are the father. And then you'll see some kind of fighting one way or another, people beating each other up. So these kinds of testing today for paternity with DNA is extraordinarily common. Are these tests sufficient to render that child a mamzer? If someone does a DNA test and finds out that, and believe me, these things are happening all the time. This is not crazy, rare cases at all. This is happening in the secular world quite a bit. So it's fascinating, and this was your question about when we incorporate DNA evidence into halacha. So this is a fascinating case where the result is the following. Regarding, and I'll read this in the English, this is a decision of the Beis Din of Shmuel Vosner Zatzal, who one of the great poskim of the late 20th century. Regarding the matter, actually in the bottom is in Hebrew, so I'll read this one in Hebrew. Al dvar hashela him likvoa mamzerus al smach ihat ama ben av lebano. You do a genetic test, you find out the child's not related to the father. He's not the biological father. Ein likvoa mamzerus al smach b'dikazu. We will not render this child a mamzer based on this test. Even though it is absolutely definitive, dispositive proof that he is not related to this man. Scientifically. We will not declare this person a mamzer. Why not? So, I mean, I'm not going to go into this because it's a little detailed, but the point is there are many reasons to cast doubt on whether he's actually a technical mamzer, coupled with the fact that with mamzerus in particular, it's built into the halachic system that the rabbis will bend over backwards not to render someone a mamzer. What happens if someone is declared an official mamzer vadai, an absolute certain mamzer?
Can marry and
They can only marry someone of equivalent status, basically a mamzeris, maybe one other category. They can, and never comes back. It's not like, certain people who can return to Klal Yisrael after a number of generations. Once a mamzer, always a mamzer. It's a status in perpetuity forever. So they will not declare someone a mamzer unless you know 1,000% that person is really a mamzer. If there's any suffix whatsoever, they will work very hard not to bend over backwards. So even though the DNA says this is not the halachic father, they will figure out ways. Well, maybe the child was born by artificial insemination, and we said artificial insemination. There's no mamzeris because there's no physical act. Maybe the father is not Jewish. We just said a non-Jewish father doesn't create mamzeris. So there's a whole host of things that could impact on this.
If the mother admits to it in court, like in Basin, she's never had an illicit relationship with a Jewish man while I was married to this woman. And it's not good.
So every case is going to have to be judged independently, but you need to have some form of testimony, some form of edus. Her statement,
Well, she's a woman.
but even still, her testimony would not be sufficient without corroborating, without witness testimony.
It has to be like, they're gonna have to be like.
Kind of, right. As close to that as possible. You're not going to get that kind of a rise to that level of evidence, but you have to see the couple, separate out and yichud together and that kind of thing, etc. So following along the chain of mamzeris, another dimension of mamzeris, can we use modern medicine and technology to help someone who is a mamzer and who is a mamzer vadai? Can we somehow use modern medicine or technology to break that chain of mamzeris? So listen to two possible suggestions. One that's sort of a simpler suggestion, one based on very cutting-edge science. So there is a posek who says that mamzeris, even though Moshe said there's no mamzeris without a physical relationship, but what is transmitted? What aspects of the status of the husband are transmitted to the child when the child is produced artificially? So let's say the father is a Kohen, and he gives his reproductive seed, but doesn't have a physical relationship with the woman. Is the child that results a Kohen or not? So this posek of Senderovitz was the Rosh Kollel in Milwaukee, actually. So he suggested that maybe if you have a mamzer who uses simple artificial insemination to produce a child, maybe that will break the chain of mamzeris. Maybe the status of mamzeris is not conveyed when he doesn't have a physical relationship. But most people say that kahuna, levia are all transmitted. And since those are transmitted, it's difficult to say that the status of mamzeris is not transmitted. So most people would reject that. That would be a pretty simple and good solution to break a chain of mamzeris. But I'll share with you another possibility, which is way out there. Our discussion is not about the definition of maternity and paternity, but this research impacts that discussion. Just a very brief background. One of the more fascinating medical halacha discussions today is who is the mother of a child in different variations and permutations of assisted reproduction. So it used to be there's only one mother. The same mother provided the egg, the same mother provided the sperm, provided the gestation, the womb, right? So there's only one halachic mother. But today you have what's called surrogate motherhood. So the question is now, you have someone who donates the egg and then someone who carries the child. Who's the halachic mother of that child? You have two women now vying for that.
You have a donated uterus.
And I can have a uterus transplant.
And then mRNA also. Some people they'll.
So you're thinking mitochondrial DNA. I don't know if we're going to have time. You guys can tell me to stop whenever you want to stop. But
We'll get you again.
If we have time, we can discuss mitochondrial DNA also. Yes, mitochondrial DNA is another possible contributor. But the question is, who is considered? And it's major machlokas. Some say it's the genetic mother. Some say it's the gestational mother. By the way, I have to share with you this case. If you haven't heard about this case, this is just a crazy case. Erie definitely knows this case. No question about it. So this is a case that happened in Eretz Yisrael. This family underwent assisted reproduction, was supposed to be artificial insemination. or IVF using the reproductive seed of both the husband and the wife. No donation from anybody outside the marriage. So they go to the IVF laboratory, they get the egg, it's a fertilized egg that's implanted, she becomes pregnant. They do an ultrasound on the child, they find that there's some irregularity, they need to do an amniocentesis. They do an amniocentesis, they do routine genetic testing, lo and behold, they find out that this child is not genetically related, neither to the father nor to the mother. Which means
They didn't have hashgacha.
they didn't have hashgacha in many ways, in the classic sense and in the technical sense, means that this embryo belonged to another couple. Now, normally, you would go to the lab and they would be able to determine which couple this would be. And they would test the other embryos in the lab, do genetic testing, and be able to find out who the parents were. And then you could have a discussion, who's going to keep the child. Until today, as far as I know, they have not been able to identify who the genetic parents of this child are. So the poskim in Eretz Yisrael are debating and discussing who is the halachic mother, and in this case, mother's most important. Is the child Jewish? Does the child need gerus? Are the donors non-Jewish? Is the egg donor not Jewish?
Well, for instance, in Israel, 70% Jewish.
Right. So a whole host of fascinating issues. Do they need to actively seek out who the genetic mother is, or can we rely on the fact maybe the birth mother is the halachic mother and leave it at that and end of the discussion? So many fascinating things. So there are issues that relate to maternity. So what's the latest, which has only occurred in proof of concept, never has happened yet in reality, is the following, which could theoretically break the chain of Mamzeris, and that is what's called artificial reproductive seed. What's artificial reproductive seed? And I'll share with you the scenario which is discussed in the secular world, and you can see this is not necessarily accepted in the halachic world, and that's if you have a couple of the same gender. Let's say you have a couple of the same gender. Let's say you have two women that want to have a child. Now, many of you took basic biology, even if you didn't take basic biology, is it possible for two women to produce a child that's genetically related to both of them?
Yes.
So the answer is no, right? You need the sperm has to come from a man and the egg comes from a woman. So it has not been possible for people of the same gender to produce a child that's related to both of them until now. What do we know now? What is the idea? And this is just proof of concept. This is not hasn't yet been done in humans. It is now theoretically possible to take a stem cell from a woman and guide that stem cell to produce a gamete. What's a gamete? A gamete is the cell of sexual generation, and here's the kicker. That gamete can either be an egg or a sperm.
It's not just like mitochondrial.
So now, for those of you who understand the mechanics of genetics, it's going to have to be a sperm. It's going to have to be an X sperm. So she's not going to be able to produce a male child, right? Because she doesn't have Y chromosomes. So, but she can produce a sperm that's an X sperm. Then you can then take the egg of her partner and fertilize it, and then implant it into either one of them to produce a child. So the $64,000, today's $64 billion question, who is the halachic father of that child? Think about it. Never, ever, ever in the history of mankind has anyone ever, and I use this term intentionally, conceived of the notion of anyone other than a man contributing the sperm to a child, and anyone other than a woman contributing the egg. And by the way, the converse is also true. A man, the stem cell of a man, can be guided to produce an egg. So returning it to the mamzeris issue, let's say this man who's 100% mamzer, and let's make it interesting, let's take his stem cell and produce an egg. Produce an egg from that stem cell. It's not even a sperm, it's an egg. And fertilize it with the sperm of another person. Maybe they came from a woman and produce a child. Is that child a mamzer? Who said this, the status of mamzeris is going to be transmitted to this basically artificially reproduced gametes? Not so pashut, not so simple. Now, no, I will tell you, no posik is paskined on this. Not the kind of stuff that poskim are paskening on. But these are sort of things to think about. Now, another dimension, and this relates to Moshe's Psach, and you'll see how this, if you haven't seen some of this literature, it's really quite frightening. Sperm donors, this goes back 2019. I'm going to relate it to the issue of Yibum for our halachic purposes. Sperm donors cannot stay secret anymore. Here's what that means. To be the biological child of an anonymous sperm donor today is to live in a state of perpetual anticipation. Having never imagined a world in which donors could be tracked down by DNA, in their early years, sperm banks did not limit the number of families to whom one donor's sperm would be sold, which means that many of the children conceived have half siblings in the dozens. There are hundreds of biological half sibling groups that number more than 20. And the last sentence, groups larger than 100 are far from rare, which means they are not rare. Which means there are many groups of more than 100. So when Moshe said he was concerned about the possibility of paternal siblings marrying, he knew exactly what he was talking
The
about.
horse races.
And
take
the
a stud
secular
and just-
world,
Genetic siblings, those who are artificial insemination, they luckily allowed to get married. If it's a non-Jewish donor.
And the Jewish mother.
If it's non-Jewish, non-Jewish
no, but the
father.
mother, if the mother is Jewish, then they're both halachically.
Technically, DNA, they're siblings, but they luckily should be get married if it's a.
Right, but that's
Right, if they're non-Jewish, right, if the donor's not Jewish, that would be correct.
What
That'd
if
be
there
correct.
would be a non-Jewish donor and a non-Jewish mother? Do we take this principle of Enya?
No, so we don't, that wouldn't be halachically concerning for them.
It wouldn't be?
It wouldn't be. I mean, it would be genetically concerning for them. I mean, because to marry two genetic siblings.
Goyim also have the same din of Arias.
But I don't think in terms of Shem Yisa'ach Sachoso, are we concerned for them for genetics? I'm not sure.
Besides for, in-group reasons.
Right, no, but by the way, you could also do pre-implantation genetic diagnosis on the embryo to see if the embryo is carrying genetic disease, which would be more common in consanguinity. So you can eliminate that problem in that way also. And then if there is a disease, you could do CRISPR and then to in the Dover. So these are so this was a front page of a New York Times magazine about a year ago. I'm 20. I have 32 half siblings. This is my family portrait. Now, what makes it very interesting about these half siblings is that many people have half siblings, and many people have second marriages, third marriages, and they have siblings of whole age ranges. What's interesting about these half siblings, which can number over 100, is that they are all roughly around the same age, because when donation was made, it's generally used within a very short period of time. So you could have 100 half siblings that are all within like 2 to 3 years of age. It's crazy. It's absolutely crazy.
Were they even freezing it? Or-
I'm sorry?
Was sperm able to be frozen 30 years ago?
They use it too fast. to
So
freeze.
the
Look at
very
this.
first reproductive seed that was frozen was sperm was frozen, I think, in the 1950s already. The first and the reason they froze sperm initially was for astronauts, because they wanted to preserve fertility. They said, you're going up into space, there's a good chance you're not coming back down. So they actually figured out how to freeze sperm in order to preserve fertility for astronauts. I mean, we're not talking about this, but there's a whole nother issue in terms of posthumous insemination, using sperm after the husband dies.
Didn't that just happen? That story happened as a soldier.
Yeah, it just happened in Israel. And actually there is a bill, I'm not sure where it stands now with all the elections, but there is a bill in the Knesset to facilitate posthumous insemination from Israeli soldiers, to allow the family to use their reproductive seed. And that, that's another case we could discuss at another time. There's another case, you just can't make this stuff up, where this woman was asked to her husband, they just gotten married within the last year or so. Very tragically, her husband died in an accident in a military exercise. So they asked her very shortly after he died if she wanted to harvest his reproductive seed for future use, and she said yes. They procured, I think, 12 samples. Then she ended up remarrying, having her own children, but the soldier's parents wanted to use the reproductive seed to produce another child. And the mother, I think the mother was even considering being the gestational carrier for the child. The former wife, the widow, she vetoed. She said, I refuse to allow them to use the seed. And the question was, does she have veto rights? Does it belong to her? Who said the seed belongs to her? And in terms of, so there's a secular analysis, which relates to Israeli law. Then there's a halakhic analysis. Is she a yoresh? And who is yoresh, the reproductive seed? The same thing if you have frozen embryos that are in the laboratory and a couple passes away. There's a case of a couple who I think died in a plane crash, and they had frozen embryos in the laboratory. To whom do they belong? Do you split it like a Yerusha? Half go here. Or if it's odd number, do you divide one of the embryos in half? Like just like washing machines and jewelry and real estate and stuff like that. So it's not simple. These are all complicated things.
You sent the army, asked the wife for permission to get the harvest. Did they ask the parents too?
No, I don't believe they did at that time. So at that time, from a secular perspective, it makes sense. I mean, this was the wife. You're not going to ask the parents. So she's the one who gave consent. So they did give more credence. The secular government gave more credence to her than they did to the parents. But halacha wouldn't necessarily concur with that. One sperm, 150 offspring. I fathered 800 children. Claimed sperm donor. You can't make this stuff up. And I don't know if you guys have heard about this, about fertility fraud. There's a Netflix special called Our Father, where, or for those of you who haven't heard about it, it's these people, this is what's happening. These people, some of them know they're the products of assisted reproduction, some of them do not. They get a call out of the blue, I think you're my half brother. I think we share the same father. Usually they don't know who that father is. So there's a group of people who got together and they found out, who their father was. Who did it turn out was their father? The physician, who is the reproductive specialist who's taking care of all of their parents, is treating them for infertility. He was using his own sperm to inseminate, I think at last count, somewhere in the 80s, maybe in the 90s, in terms of children. So you might think that this is some crazy, megalomaniac or egomaniac or whatever theological, philosophical issue that he has and wants to produce children. But what's fascinating and forces us to sort of rethink where this is coming from, if I were to ask you how many physicians in this country are being suspected for using their own reproductive seed to produce multiple children, how many would you say? 3, 5, 10? The answer is over 60. Over 60 physicians apparently were using their own reproductive seed. So there's more to it. It might even be something as someone, I'm not necessarily, Don LaCostos, I'm not rushing to defend these guys necessarily, but it might be something as simple as they wanted to have positive results for their patients. It's much easier for them to procure their own reproductive seed than to get other reproductive seed. This is the very early stages of assisted reproduction where getting seed is much more complicated process, much more expensive, much more legally complicated. They figured this is easy enough. We'll just do it that way.
It shows the parent's profile, white, male, educated.
Right.
Functionals, better than any drug addict.
Were they looking for donors? Were they looking for their own husband?
Like, I don't understand what the problem is if they're looking for a donor and he says, here, I have
Right.
donor. Well, like, what's the big deal? Who
Right.
cares?
The problem is they didn't consent to it. So if you would have asked them and said, I'll do it.
They came to get donor sperm, didn't they?
Right. Yeah, true.
So did they?
So that's the defense. That's their defense attorney. You're going to be your arguing your defense. So let's bring this back. Let's bring this back to halachic ramifications.
So
Let's bring this back to halachic.
you have your kids, smile and go on.
Where's he read? Give me a time limit. Tell me how much more.
5 more minutes.
So how does this relate to the issue of Yibum? How does this relate to the issue of Yibum? I'll just show it to you, and you're welcome to think of other creative scenarios. These are just a few things to think about. if a married man dies without a child from his wife, let's say this man, for the sake of discussion, this Donnie Shapiro, let's say her donor was a Jewish man. Okay, he wasn't. Let's say he was a Jewish man. Let's say he got married and he didn't, and he died before having any children with his wife. Right? Does his wife have to undergo yibum or chalitza? Right? Because the halacha is, if a woman's husband dies and they were childless, then she has to marry that man's brother. So the answer is, if they didn't have any children, she would have to go. In Ashkenazi tradition, we only do chalitza. We don't do yibum today. Although Sephardic tradition in some parts of the world, even today, is to do yibum, even if you're already married to somebody else, even to do yibum. We don't. That's not our minhag. The answer is, if he had a child from someone else, she doesn't have to undergo yibum or chalitza. She's completely free to remarry. But she's not necessarily going to know that if he donated his sperm when he was in medical school. And furthermore, for half-sibling groups, let's say you got 120 in your half-sibling group, and they're all men, they're all boys, right? If any one of those male half-brothers produced through donation dies childless, then you got 119, that could potentially do a yibum rechalitza. So if the first 5 or 10 refused, do you have to seek out every one of the 120 to in order to perform yibum rechalitza? And maybe any woman would have trouble remarrying out of the concern that there are other people there who who could potentially do yibum chalitza, that her husband had many half brothers. And so the question is, if a woman is about to undergo yibum chalitza, and this is a fascinating question and not so crazy, do you have to put the sperm of the husband into the databases to see if he has any existing children?
In the DNA.
The DNA. Yeah, if you put his DNA in. Sorry, yeah.
You know that
Take a hair, and put and enter it into these databases to see if you have any children. Now, this is all completely hypothetical, but it's not so insane. It's not.
If from a non-Jew, there's no father, right?
No father, right?
And artificial insemination from a Jew is a father?
Artificial insemination from a Jew, that Jew, it's machlokes. In the early stages, some said no, but most people paskin today that the person is absolutely the halachic father. He does fulfill the mitzvah of puravu, and so there is dissent, but if he's a Kohen, the child would be a Kohen.
The only one that would argue could be Tzitzi.
In terms of what?
Tzitzi has a funny psak where there is no father.
There's no mother. He holds in assisted in gestational host. He says if
there is no mother.
There's no mother. He says different piskei halacha and different shuvas, but there's one shuva he said if insemination does not take place within the body of the woman, then there is no halachic mother to that child. I'm not sure what he says about paternity. Maybe he says somewhere else, but I'm not offhand familiar what he says about maternity. But he says with respect to maternity, there's no halachic mother. So I'll go for another 5 minutes. I'll just run through some of the other fascinating cases. Inheritance, which is the title of the book. Let's say someone comes and he says, this billionaire dies, and he, his son inherits the money, and the guy knocks on the door and he goes, Yosef, you're not going to believe this. I'm your long lost brother. I haven't seen you all these years, but I just did 23andMe, and I found out that I'm here to share your fortune with you.
And I'm older.
So is that sufficient? Is a DNA test sufficient to do that? So the answer is it depends on the circumstance. It's not a simple yes or no. It depends if the family already inherited. If they already inherited, to claim inheritance once it's already been divided is more halachically complicated. If this man died without known children, and this person does a DNA test, and there's no other claimants to the inheritance, and this determines with genetic certainty that this is the male child of this person, then yes, indeed, he might be able to inherit. Criminality, determining criminality. Yeah, so I don't know if you haven't noticed these cases, you will. If your eyes and ears are open for it, probably every week to 2 weeks you're going to notice these cold cases that get solved by DNA bank. What does that mean? You have these serial murderers from 40, 50 years ago that were never identified.
It's the case just now, the poor student killed in Idaho. Goes through 23 and years.
So that one I didn't hear. That's probably what, over the last couple of days? Yes.
I think it was the first time that they used it for an open case, like a current open case, that they use like on a.
Right, usually they're cold cases that are so, so that's great. See, so you're gonna see those kinds of cases all the time. So how does it work? It works the following way. So usually these guys are long dead in these cold cases. Usually these guys are long dead. So you're not gonna find their DNA in the database. But what you might find, if they still have DNA from the crime scene, they'll enter that DNA in and they'll find a relative. They'll find a cousin, right? Or a nephew. Right, so they'll knock on the nephew's door and they say, you know, hi, we're the police department. We have reason to believe that your uncle might have been a serial killer. You know, can you shed light on the situation? So he says, yeah, Uncle Frank, yeah, the really odd guy, Frank. Yeah, he had this barn in the backyard and had this huge lock on it, and we were never allowed anywhere near that barn. You know, and then they start doing some inspection, and they solve all these cases, and every few weeks they solve these amazing cases. Sooner or later, your cousin's DNA is going to solve a murder. That's why some people are afraid to enter the database. They don't. You know, I'm not going to do the details. You can look all these up. But he escaped from jail after allegedly killing his wife a century ago. You know, they discovered his torso and they identified through DNA. So the question is DNA sufficient to sentence these people to death for having committed a crime? Let's say a person's still alive. So the answer is absolutely not.
I mean,
It's you need to have
Not for capital punishment.
You have to have, even if the DNA is 100% accurate, it's not sufficient.
Our current testing is 100% accurate.
It's very close to 100%.
That's what it's called, chimeras.
So chimerism is a whole nother can of worms. And chimerism it adds a little bit of suffix to this, but chimerism is so rare. So chimerism, let me show you a crazy case of chimerism from fictional literature. Jodi Picoult. Anybody read Jodi Picoult's novels? So I don't even remember which novel this was. You guys will tell me. So she, this woman, her child was molested by a priest. The priest is in open court and being accused of molesting her child. They open up the DNA evidence. DNA evidence confirms that there's a DNA match to the reproductive seed that was found at the scene, whatever. So she stands up in court. She pulls out a gun, kills the guy in cold blood, in the middle of the courtroom. It wasn't him. What was the case? Case was this guy was I don't want to mess up. This guy was a bone marrow recipient, and his donor was a fellow priest. And when the donor donated the bone marrow, it regenerates the entire bone marrow system, regenerates the entire blood. That DNA comes from the donor. DNA of the blood comes from the donor. So when they did the simple blood test for the DNA, it turned out that it was a match, but he wasn't guilty of the crime. The donor was the one who was guilty of the crime. But there's another fascinating aspect of chimerism, which is not iatrogenic, which is not created by human beings, but a natural form of chimerism, which is manifests more and more commonly. It's still exceedingly rare, but we're discovering it more than has ever been in the past. And here's the scenario. Now that again, you can't make this stuff up. This woman is claiming for financial support from the government, from her husband, I think it was, who divorced her. And she wants to get Social Security for the kids, and routine testing. They just want to confirm that these kids are your DNA kids before they start dishing out money from the government for financial support. They do a DNA test on her. They do a DNA test on the kids. They said, "I'm sorry, but these kids are not your genetic children." She says, "What do you mean these aren't your genetic children?" These aren't my genetic children. So you can call my obstetrician. He was in the delivery room for both these deliveries. He'll tell you that these are my kids. So they take the kids away from her. Bureau of Child Welfare comes in. and removes her children. Very, very fortunately, this happened probably about 10 years ago already. She was alive when they were just starting to discover this aspect of chimerism. What happens in this aspect of chimerism? What happens is you have twins in utero, and one of the twins dies and fuses to the other twin. And when that child grows up, that child is a chimera of both. So part of their body will be from DNA of child A, and part of the body will be from DNA of child B. So her ovaries were from her twin. So when they tested the ovary, when they did an ovarian biopsy and did DNA of the ovary, there's a match to the children. When they did a blood test, it wasn't a match. Oh yeah, yeah, we told about that now. So, maybe another time. It's another fascinating case. It's a uterus transplant case. But so I forget where we were. So chimerism does cast some aspersion on genetic testing, but it's so rare. It's so rare that it doesn't cause enough of a suffix. This is another very recent case. This is from December 8th. A child that was found in a box 65 years ago was never identified. It's finally identified. Question is, you identify these persons with DNA. Can you act on that? So the answer is, if it's an unmarried person, then the family can sit Shiva. If it was a married person, it's a little more complicated, because then it implies that the wife can remarry, which is not so clear that she can. It's not clear that there's enough evidence for her to remarry. Burial of body parts, this is also an issue. Yes, you're allowed to use DNA for burial of body parts. Here, just to mention very briefly, and a fascinating topic, and for those of you more interested, you can read this book, Contending with Catastrophe. When the Twin Towers fell in 9/11, there were, I think, 11 or 12 cases, tragically, of married Jewish men who died that day. And the question was, permitting their wives to remarry. And you could only permit a wife to remarry when you have certain evidence that the husband is dead. So there was no eyewitness testimony. The buildings just collapsed. And in some cases, they had corroborating evidence that they were in the building. They literally did extraordinary detective work to be able to clarify whether these people were in that building at the time, and rise to enough level of evidence to be able to permit the wives to remarry. But in some cases, the only evidence they had was DNA. They found literally a small piece of DNA at the scene, and that DNA was identified as the husband's DNA. So the question was that DNA sufficient to release the woman from aguna status? So you're used to aguna as like the recalcitrant husband. But the classic form of aguna in the Gemara is a woman whose husband goes away on a trip and never comes back. And you don't know if he died in a foreign country when he was on business, or if he just left and never came back and remarried and had another family somewhere else. There's no way to know that. So this brought to the fore the whole issue of DNA. And what's interesting is that with respect to mamzerus, we said that poskim bend over backwards not to render someone a mamzer. With respect to aguna, it's the exact opposite. Poskim will bend over backwards to try to release the woman from aguna status. So there's a very, very complex, lengthy analysis about whether DNA is sufficient. Is it equivalent to other forms of body identification or to edus? And Rabbi Bleich has an entire book just on DNA and halacha, which goes through that analysis extensively.
So you want to strand of hair, meaning that they were there the day before, not necessarily because it proved that they were there.
Right, there's a lot of ifs. You could do a lot of different directions. And I'll close with a couple of fascinating stories from ancestry identification of lost relatives. This is the case that you mentioned before. This is from the Ashkenazi Jews have become more genetically similar over time. This was a cemetery. This is very, very rare that geneticists would have this kind of opportunity. It was an entire cemetery, which was found in an area that they were doing construction in Germany. And they exhumed the entire cemetery. Normally, they just rebury very quickly, but for whatever political reason, literally for years, the remnants remained in a building in Germany. So somehow these geneticists connected with this with this dig and with these bodies, and they wanted to do a genetic analysis. But there were poskim involved because these are Jewish bodies. They said, are you violating the bodies in an issur of nivel hameis, desecration of the body, in order to perform genetic testing? So they were very creative. So the body, the bones, if you're disturbing the actual physical bones, there may be a concern of nivel hameis. Well, you can make an argument if you're just doing a small little something, but they said instead, if you can take DNA from the teeth, from the remaining teeth, because teeth aren't considered bones. When you look in the Mishnah and Olos about there's 248 limbs in the body, and in terms of what's considered an aver, in terms of what's obligated to bury, technically teeth is not on that list. So they found bodies that had teeth, and they extracted from the pulp of the teeth the DNA, and they were able to do their DNA analysis from the teeth. Really fascinating stuff. And they came to that conclusion that we mentioned before. And this is also very new. Holocaust survivors offered DNA tests to help find family. They're offering free DNA testing kits to Holocaust survivors to help identify family. This is also crazy.
It was recent. It's really recent.
This is really recent. This is November 29th. Woman believed to be 1971 kidnap victim reunites with family.
And she only lived a couple blocks away all the years.
This is crazy. So this a family, they got a new babysitter, and the babysitter asked, do you mind if I bring the baby home to my house? 2-year-old kid. They never met the babysitter before. They didn't know the babysitter. Babysitter knocks on the door, picks up the 2-year-old child, takes the child away. It's the last they ever saw that child. 51 years later, through DNA, this child was alive, well, and lived just a few blocks from where the baby was taken. Insane, the sugar stories. And I'll close with this one. This also is just an unbelievable story, and shows you the power of DNA. Just take a look at that picture in the middle of this document. This woman was in Auschwitz, online in Auschwitz. She had 2 other daughters in addition to the daughter that she's holding. In this picture, the daughter's about roughly around a year old. When she was standing in line with her daughter at Auschwitz, the daughter was about 2 years old. While she was standing in line, her daughters went into another line. She was in this line. The Nazis, Yimach Shemam, took the daughter from her hands. They wrested the daughter from her. And that's the last time she ever saw her daughter. When she survived the war, her other 2 daughters survived the war. They came back to the United States. They lived in the United States. She never, ever stopped looking for that daughter. She went to Europe, went to every single orphanage, went to every single documents, records, in order to track down that child. Now, keep in mind, the child was too young to self-identify. So the child wouldn't even be able to say their own name. And the child is also very young. The features of the child are going to change radically over the next couple of years. Even your own mother might not even recognize you in a few years of change. She slept, according to the daughters, she slept with this picture and cried herself to sleep with that picture under her pillow for many, many years. When she died, before she died, she made her children promise to keep the search for that child. This is like 40, 50 years later. After she died, a few years later, one of those daughters entered into the database. Not even necessarily for this, was doing it for some other issue, and she got a hit. She got a hit from a niece, identified a niece that lived in some godforsaken small town in the middle of England. She contacted that niece. Who was that niece? That woman was the daughter of that long lost sister. That sister miraculously survived Auschwitz as a 2-year-old infant. How that happened, nobody knows. Did not self-identify, never knew her name, got a different name, went to a non-Jewish family, grew up as a non-Jewish family. Unfortunately, by the time they had done that DNA testing, that sister had passed away, but her children survived. And that daughter survived and was able to reunite with her 2 aunts who were still alive. And what's amazing is that absent DNA testing, there is no physical way in the entire world through any other means that these two would have ever united across the face of the earth. Never, ever. The only way they got together was through this DNA testing. So in conclusion, we've had an opportunity to cover some fascinating aspects of
Let's
this.
brings up another thing, this whole story, just, says Yaakov Avinu mourned for Yosef Atzadik for all the years. But if somebody's dead, the Abishah creates this thing that the mourning stops. The fact that he mourned all these years was because Yosef was still alive.
Right.
She mourned all the years because the child was still
I
alive.
like that. It's a beautiful idea. Really beautiful
Otherwise, she would
idea.
have stopped the mourning.
Right. So that's why Yosef had a connection to his father, and his father had the connection to Yosef because he somehow knew
There's
that there was some connection that he was still alive. So maybe she sort of sensed all those years and never gave up hope because she sensed that she was actually alive. So we covered a couple of fascinating issues. Now let me ask you guys again: how many of you want to do DNA testing after today's talk? Not too many hands are going up.
I have enough with the relatives I already have. I need more.
Like, I don't know, this inherent like. Yeah, I think it's been rounded up based on our clients and like.
Can I tell you one more story? One more fascinating story. This one is so this is a very positive story. This one is a crazy story. This woman does DNA testing. She finds out she comes from an Irish Catholic family. She finds out that her father is Jewish. Her father's not alive anymore. She finds out she's 50% Ashkenazi Jewish. She comes from real long Irish Catholic for many, many, many years. She does all this research, and she thinks maybe he's a product of the Holocaust, right? Maybe the kid went to an orphanage, maybe he got adopted by a Catholic family. No trace, no record whatsoever. Zero. No connection to the Holocaust. Nothing related to Germany. Zero. This goes on for years, many years. Then a Jewish woman who believes she's 100% Ashkenazi Jewish finds out she's 50% Irish, and they are related. They're just sort of distantly related. So they hook up with each other and they team up and they do a lot of research, and it takes them a lot of time, and they keep getting some additional hits and sort of pulling things together, piece things together. And it turns out that around 1926, in a small hospital in Brooklyn, two families came in to deliver a baby, an Ashkenazi Jewish family and a nice Irish Catholic family. When they left, however, the Irish Catholic family went home with the nice Jewish baby, and the Jewish family went home with the Irish Catholic baby. That was in 1920s. That was in the 1920s. It's even more. It's like it's in the last couple of years. So it's great.
That's the Gior
Now,
stuff like
so that happened to be two male children. Had it been two females, I can't even imagine the halachic ramifications of that. That means that all the generations that came out of that first woman would all be non-Jewish, and all of her progeny would be non-Jewish. Crazy. Ask again, how many of us want to do that test? Anybody?
Like I said, I have enough with the relatives I have already.
Right. Some people are looking for relatives. Some of us are not looking for more relatives.
My sister belonged to some kind of club, whatever, and all the years, and she said,
Take it down.
Oh,
We're done.
I'm just told. So, said to my sister, so what did you find out? She said, well, I'm 99.7% after that. But people are Africans.
Right, so it's so funny because like these Jews, so these people in England that told me that they all came up to me and said, you know, I'm 99.99% Jewish. They said, where's that 0.1% from? That's what they asked. Where'd the 0.1% come from?
I think that this based on the accuracy of the test.
Yeah, it's only. Yeah, one person said it was 100%. Occasionally, I get people that say it's 100%. I don't know just statistically. Yeah, thank you very much. Great to see you guys.